Hi, thanks for coming today. This is Designing Experiences for iPad, a one-on-one on designing UX for iPad. I'm going to talk a lot about a good UX process for designing tablet apps and a number of helpful tablet design principles that you can feel comfortable applying to your own apps by the end of this. If you're a veteran user experience designer, this is probably not going to be tailored quite to your needs. But if you're more just learning about UX, this should be great for you. So I'm Jenica. I am a software interaction designer at National Instruments. I've also worked in the web industry doing UX for a number of clients and as a user researcher. Today I'm going to talk about our app data dashboard, a little bit about a good UX process for tablets, a few tablet design principles, and then see if anyone has any questions. So our app data dashboard. So before I can start talking about that, I should probably give you guys a little bit of context around the app. So National Instruments has a successful platform of products that work on both a Mac and a PC. And engineers and scientists use these products to create custom test and control systems. That's something you saw in the keynote. So we wanted to build a companion product for the tablet to help monitor data remotely using web services, to help monitor these custom test and control systems. So this is where Data Dashboard comes in. So our first release was more of a technology exploration. We could totally consume web services using the device, but our actual dashboards had fixed layouts, basic UI elements. About 8 months later, with a larger team, we released another data dashboard specifically for iOS, and this one had freeform layout, a lot more UI elements, and it was very customizable for the user. Now, data dashboard itself isn't the subject of this presentation, but I'm going to give you a really quick demo because I refer to it throughout the course of the presentation. So this is fast. I used QuickTime with our simulator. You can see that we had a carousel. The user's creating a new dashboard. They're going to change the background properties. They're going to change the color, and then drop some UI elements. And the main really distinctive feature of our app is being able to connect to web services, being able to connect to data so scientists can monitor their control systems. So, some basic UI stuff, copy and paste, some alignment. We can delete UI elements, all stuff you guys are probably relatively familiar with. So this is the differentiator. Be patient, we're going to run it in a minute. So, all right. Now we can see what the values of our variables. So this is the basic idea of data dashboard. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here, the UX process. So design is a process, not a product, right? And I'm sure you guys can empathize that there are aspects of your work where people don't really understand all the detail that goes into it, right? But design is not necessarily just a static comp that I put on a wall, right? So Audit and I, to talk a little bit about this process, we have two design disciplines, interaction design and visual design. Our interaction designers, such as myself, are much more into the behavior of the UI, and our visual designers are thinking about look and typography and those sorts of things. So in addition to the developers, these are the other people involved in our UX design process. I'm going to come at it more from the interaction design angle. So you're probably thinking, why is she talking so much about process? It's pretty simple, right? You design something, you implement it, we're done, right? But actually, the best UX design process for tablets is really padded with two other phases, and that is discovery and verify. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So discovery is uncovering users' motivations. design is really about planning what you're going to build. Verify is about making sure that users are perceiving your design the way that you think it works. And you guys already know a lot about implementation. It's when we're building it. So this discovery stuff sounds a little frou-frou, a little soft. Why would I bother doing that? But without discovery, it can be really difficult to make good design decisions that support the success of your product. Decision-making becomes muddled and subjective. It's my opinion versus your opinion. So when you do this sort of work, it prevents things like this happening to your product, right? The seagull comes in, it swoops down and kind of poops on it and then flies away. So, you know, we have people from other teams, executives, they come in and they're like, you know what, this kind of sucks. And, you know, you're sort of stuck there. You don't have any data to back up why you're doing it a certain way. And you're just sort of like, okay, now what do I do? So then this guy looks kind of angry. He comes in. So this is the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, right? And this guy, you know, he's well-meaning, you know, but he is stretched on a lot of different things. So having him have the context to make good decisions about your product probably isn't going to happen. So really that's why it's important to do the discovery work. So that's why you really want to reach out and talk to a few people. So who do you talk to? Well, first of all, you might actually want to talk to the hippo. So you want to talk to your stakeholders, and you're really trying to glean what is the purpose and goal of the project. If you are just a team of 2 people, it might just be getting really concrete about these things. But above all, you really want to get to who are the users. This is the most important thing you're trying to get out of talking to all of your stakeholders. Because this is who you're going to talk to next. And this is really important for tablets especially. Sure, you can go ahead and interview users, but what you really want to do is observe them in their context. So historically, we have been able to make a pretty strong assumption that someone is sitting at a desk, typing away in front of a computer. We know a lot about their context. Maybe the process around them changes. But with tablets, I can be in an airport, I can be just about anywhere under the sun, right? So we really want to make sure that we understand a lot about the user's context. Are they using their tablet in tandem with a desktop or a laptop? Are they, do they have gloves? Does your app even make sense for that user, right? You know, if your user's wearing gloves, you might want to reconsider tablets. What tablet are they using, you know, currently? So these are all things that are really important to understand about your user. Above all, you want to establish a master-apprentice relationship and sort of watch them do their work. You want to understand their main tasks, the main thing that they're trying to achieve, and understand both the good things and the pain points about that, because those are things you really want to address in your app. Above all, you really want to uncover their mental model about the way they think your thing that you're trying to learn more about should work. A really simple example of this is shopping. So I go into stores in the real world, and I buy things. And I'm also interacting with different systems online. I buy things from Amazon. I use different apps. And together, all of this creates my mental model of how I think shopping works, right? And it's really important that you're reflecting the user's mental model and not your own model or the system's mental model in your app. So you might be wondering, okay, well, who are your users? Who are those scientists and engineers? And really, we have a wide variety of contexts ranging from the CERN particle accelerator to monitoring bridges. Let's discuss the bridge example for simplicity's sake. So, you know, bridges have been falling since we've been building them, and unfortunately this is something that still happens. The Bay Bridge comes to mind. Closer to home a few years ago, we had one of the bridges that made I-35 collapse in Minnesota, killing 13 people and injuring hundreds more. So, you know, it seems like a really basic problem, but, you know, many engineers, and some of those also at NI and UT, place sensors at different stress points within a bridge to measure data remotely to understand if the bridge is in danger, if something changes about the bridge, if it's windy, or if the temperature drops. So those are the kind of users that we were trying to address with our app. So during discovery, the next thing you really want to figure out are who are your competitors. This might seem obvious, okay? At NI, for example, we have some big competitors, right? But this wasn't really who I was interested in for the purposes of this app, right? So when I did a competitive analysis or audit, I wanted to look at people that might have analogous functionality that we would have in something that would create dashboards versus looking at our competitors that might not even have a similar sort of app. So that wasn't really interesting to me. And all of this, above all, should feed what you're building. You don't want to be, there are people that do research for research's sake, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as developers, you're really about uncovering who your users are and what their main motivations are so they can influence your requirements. So, here's an example of taking some findings and turning them into requirements. We found out that often on teams of engineers, the creator might be the only approved editor of a dashboard. So we wanted to be able to share it with a locked or unlocked state. But really, above all, you want to make sure that all of the requirements you're throwing into the hat, they're at an equal tier as everyone else who is driving requirements. UX requirements aren't just a second tier, oh, who cares about that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about design. So we've talked about, at this point, we have some requirements, and we're ready to get into design. And this is where the magic happens, right? But really, it doesn't have to be that mysterious if we take a closer look at design. So at a high level, design is really, can be broken into 3 steps. We're coming up with an idea, a concept. At this point, we might be spending a lot of time in front of a whiteboard. Then we want to define our idea and jump more deeply into it. And then it's about refining the idea. And this is probably very similar to what you guys already do as developers with code. So when you're coming up with ideas, some people are really comfortable just jumping in front of a whiteboard, sketching, not being very systematic about what they're doing. But if that doesn't really work for you, one thing that can be really helpful is identifying your core tasks. And all of these you've already learned about from your user, right? For us, they were things like creating new dashboards, connecting to data. And then you want to prioritize your tasks. So this might not really drive the order that you do your design work in, but it's going to help you elevate things in the UI that your user cares the most about. So when you're designing the overall UX framework of your app, that the most important things are easily accessible. So once you figure out the overall framework, you're still sort of in sketch mode here, and maybe you have a bunch of ideas about what that could be. You want to take each of those tasks and start jumping into the nitty-gritty of how you would actually perform that. So this is just a sketch of me trying to figure out how I would dump something onto the canvas and connect to data. So at this point, this is really for me to consume. The other people I am bouncing ideas off of, it's not really necessarily something that I would even share with the greater team or any of my stakeholders. And that's what we're going to come to next with definition. So here, this thing doesn't communicate very well. We already established that. So what we need to do at this point is build something like a blueprint to communicate our ideas. We could take the approach of just building a house to explain how our dream house would be built. But what's really expensive about that is I'm spending all of the time and energy that I was reserving to build my dream house to just try to communicate my ideas. And what can happen in the end is we say, we'll just take this house we have. What if we knock down that wall over there? Well, that might destroy the foundation, and finally we're not going to end up with what we wanted in the end. So it's really best to iterate your design and get granular where it's cheapest. And that, for us, is wireframing. So you really want to breathe life into your idea at this point. Start thinking a little bit harder about where exactly that functionality is going to be. Dig a little deeper into the experience. Think about hierarchy of functionality and information. And above all, is this going to work? Am I addressing my users' motivations? So you guys are developers, and you're probably thinking, hey, you did that in some vector drawing tool. Why would I do that? Why wireframe versus just code? That's what I do best. And it's okay to code. The thing is wireframing is more about a state of mind. You can create a prototype and it will address these needs just as easily. The important thing is not to spend a lot of time implementing something that you might just throw away. You want to be comfortable, whatever you choose to do, that you can iterate and not feel bad about losing your work. And the other reason that we're sort of creating these wireframes, other than becoming more granular about our idea, is that we want to share early and often with the rest of our team, with our main stakeholders. Does that mean that you have to necessarily take everybody's feedback? Not necessarily, but it does help you dig more deeply into the experience and challenge some of the assumptions that you're making, because those people might have been involved with uncovering who your users were too, remembering something differently. And then the next step in design is really about refinement. At this point, I'm really thinking, okay, exactly what colors am I going to be using? What does that label say? If there's content in my app, what does that content say? How do these refinements best support my users' goals? I'm also getting more granular about interactions and behaviors. So maybe during the time that I was defining my design, I'm thinking, okay, there's a toolbar on tap a menu opens. But at this point, I want to get really granular about how the details, how things are coming out of the menu onto the canvas. And at minimum, it's really important to think about consistency and make sure that your UI is coming across as clean and professional. So make sure that you're making deliberate choices about fonts and that your font is being used consistently across your app. Make sure that it has good foreground-background contrast and that it's legible. It seems like a no-brainer, but things like alignment are really important. Making deliberate choices about color, or deliberate choices about not using color if you feel uncomfortable with color is really important at this point. So those are some things. We're going to come back to design in a little while when we get to the principles. But for the moment, we're going to continue on to verification. And as you see, design and verification are iterative. I'm kind of doing them in tandem. So I'm designing something. Maybe I just have a stack of paper, and then I decide to put that in front of my users. So we'll talk briefly about verify. And really the main reason you want to do this is that you're kind of a little bit attached to your idea at this point, right? You think that you have this puppy on your left. It's cuddly, it's sweet, you're attached to your idea, you really like it, and this is how you want your users to perceive your app. But in reality, you might have this puppy on the right. And we all know that there are some puppies like that out in the real world, and we don't really want to contribute to that problem, right? So we really need to get in front of our users and make sure we have what we think we have. And then above all, we want to be really certain that we have really the mental model that we took so much time in the beginning to uncover. We want to make sure that that's being reflected in our UI. And the best way to do that is user testing. So this could be its own presentation. It's a really deep subject, and if anyone wants to learn more about it, I can totally help you out. But the most important thing is that you're putting your idea, your prototype in front of users. You can do this really informally. You can create a test plan via email, recruit participants. I used to take prototypes into coffee shops and find people there. I know that there might be some issues around confidentiality there. Then you want to conduct your sessions as simply as you can and analyze the data. My main point is that you do not need to have some big usability lab with panes of glass between you and your user. Anybody can do this. For data dashboard, we did multiple iterations of user testing. Sometimes we used paper prototypes, which were these really low fidelity prototypes that were basically like storyboards that you would walk the user through. If they deviated from something that you thought that they were going to do, you would just say, okay, I'm going to take note of that and show them the next step. What if you would have done this, right? So a paper prototype is really easy to do, and there's no code involved. And that is something that we did when we were not even sure if our idea was going to fly. We did not want the developer to spend any time with an idea until we knew that it was going to work on some level. The other option is actually using your real code. And you want to do this when you are pretty certain about the direction that you're going to go in, but you have a lot of maybe opportunities to refine your feedback, that you know that there might be something that you can gain out of the user testing that can improve your product. If for some reason at your organization you can't do this, that's understandable. You can borrow a discount usability method. So this is an example, a heuristics evaluation. This is just one usability method, and the idea here is that I'm taking this list of heuristics and I'm measuring against my UI to see that they're meeting all of these heuristics. The first 10 of them were written by this guy, Jacob Nielsen. These last few are specific to tablets, 2 of which I wrote, but really the idea is if you're comfortable with your users and you know them, you can even write your own heuristics to measure your UI against. And it's really about just being mindful about what you're designing. And there's lots of discount usability methods. We'll talk about another one a little bit later. So now you're ready to implement. So you guys already know a lot about implementation, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it from my perspective as a designer. So really, whatever I am producing for my developers, it's really coming down to where they are in the world, right? So if we're not in the same time zone, and we only have, let's say, an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening to talk, I'm definitely going to be providing something in a lot of detail, right? A lot of annotations. Even a prototype would probably be the best way to communicate with developers that are not located where I'm located. Luckily, our developers were in Austin. And we talked about pretty simple things, right? Hey, that wasn't in the wireframes. Can you go think about that? Or, hey, that was. Why is it different? But above all, at this point, because we shared early and often, we were talking about small things. Most of the big things were agreed upon because we had, first of all, shared with each other, but also with our users. Because finally, in the end, that's really what determines if something is an idea that's going to work for your intended audience. I did still learn a few lessons. One is not to write a novel. So as a consultant, a lot of our documentation for developers was valued by its weightage. And when you know your development team, even if it's just you and one other person, you want to finally make something that's easiest for you guys to consume, because that is the end audience, you know. It's also very important, and this was alluded to in the keynote, to track and correct UX bugs. Those visual bugs are just as important, and that's really going to define, you know, the level of professionalism of your app, right? So it might seem like, okay, well, that isn't going to stop the app from working, right? But any sort of usability struggles, consistencies in the UI, fonts being inconsistent, weird transitions or incorrect behaviors, it's important to keep track of them and not treat them as a second-tier thing. So we're about to shift gears. Before we move on, just a few quick takeaways. Doing discovery and verification always makes a better product. Iterate your design where it's easiest for you. And always continue thinking about the user, even during implementation. So now we're going to talk a little bit about design principles. So when you're in that design phase, these are things that you can think about that are always going to help to make a better product. So why do we even have design principles that are specific to tablets, right? So above all, we have a new interaction model, right? So for our desktop, we had our mouse, we had lots of different states of feedback. But for a tablet, we have our fat fingers, really small real estate, our hands obscuring the UI, fewer supported states of feedback. And then, of course, we have landscape and portrait. So we need to maintain consistency between these two orientations. So these are a few principles that can help you address specifically tablets. And probably the most important out of any of them is streamlining. So you really want to make sure that you're sticking to your core tasks and that they're tablet appropriate. Don't be tempted, if you already have an existing desktop app, to just port everything over to the tablet as is, because it will be overwhelming. So the time it takes to make a decision increases as the number of alternatives increases. And this is something that you can apply to just about anything in life, right? So if you confront users with this, your users don't have the same level of training as an astronaut. We can't present them with anything nearly this complicated, and they're not going to stick with your app, or they might give it a bad rating. So we want to err on the side of minimalism. And in order to do that, remember the core tasks and user goals above all that you uncovered during your initial discovery phase. Always ask yourself, hey, I'm going to take this out, and if I do, is my app still useful? And be suspicious if every solution is to add some sort of functionality. You don't want, especially because you want to maintain consistency in both landscape and portrait, you don't want to just crowd everything you can into your UI in landscape. So clear affordances. So what's an affordance? An affordance is a property in which the physical characteristics of an object or environment influence its function. So what that really means is a handle needs to communicate that you pull it, or a wheel needs to communicate that it can roll. So elements in the UI need to communicate what the user can do to them. Here is a great story that our user researcher uncovered. And this is a liquor store in Austin. And in the middle of the liquor store, there's a beer cooler. And I guess they're users, but people would walk into the beer cooler, pick up their beer, they're getting ready to leave, and they can't get out. They're putting down their beer, they're maybe trying to push the door in all kinds of places. And some of them were getting so frustrated that they were kicking the door until it broke. So the idea is, don't lock your users in the beer cooler. Make sure that there's something, maybe not exactly like this ad hoc affordance here, but maybe make sure that it's clear where they need to push or where they need to tap. We, used a lot of really simple affordances that you've probably seen in other iOS apps, right? So an element that is tappable and needs to communicate tap me. Handles communicate pull me. So always ask yourself with your UI, what is it telling me to do, right? What gesture is it telling me to use? So gestures are the primary way that we're interacting with our tablets, right? Here are some nice, safe gestures to use. Tap, press, drag, pinch and spread. But as you saw, the most intuitive gestures are anything that has to do with direct manipulation, anything that has a good affordance that says, do this to achieve that effect. Anything with a good affordance is going to be really easy to get across to your users. That doesn't mean that you can't use exotic gestures. But exotic gestures are more like accelerators. So it's more about an expert user being a little bit faster in your app. You still need to provide a path to access the same functionality or get to the same ends within the app using other UI elements. If you are tempted to design your own exotic gestures, be aware of two things. One is that it's really difficult for users to try to remember it takes 2 fingers to do this, but 3 fingers to do that. Anything with number of fingers doesn't have, maybe any affordance, and it's just purely relying on the user's memory. The other thing is, try not to do anything that can happen by accident. Shake is really cool, but if that was a delete operation, it wouldn't be a very appropriate use of that gesture, because I can just take my tablet, throw it in my bag if I'm running late, I'm running, and all of a sudden, oh, all of my dashboards are gone. So, you just want to make sure that something can't happen by accident, and if it can, that, you know, whatever you're doing is easily reversible or not that serious. So really, going back to our door metaphor, you know, an exotic gesture is more like this door on the left, where, you know, I can't figure out where to get out, and I just sort of need to know what I'm doing, pre-affordance. And simple gestures with affordances are more like this door on the right. Hey, there's a handle. I know exactly how to get out of here. Another thing to be really mindful of is, what are the reserved gestures on your platform? Now, you might say, oh, I would never, you know, try to do something like that in my app, where I would use a reserved gesture for something else. But you don't even want to get anything near, you know, you don't want to put something near the notification center that affords swiping down, because sometimes you're going to get your notification center, and sometimes the user is going to do what they actually intended. So it's just something to be kind of mindful of. So we talked a little bit about the user's context before, and why it was so important to understand their context, because it's really different than with a desktop or a laptop, right? So in addition to trying to be mindful of what your user, where they are when they're using their tablet, and what other technology they're also using in tandem with their tablet, you want to be aware of ergonomic issues. So you want to understand how your users are actually holding their tablet, if they're using two hands, if they're resting it on a desktop, like literally on a desktop. If they have it on top of something, how does that change their position? Because this might influence where you're going to place your UI elements and controls. Also be very aware that people's hands aren't perfect. Not only do they obscure the screen, but some people's fingers are fat. And you know, this is my mother's hand. She uses her iPad for 5 hours a day. You can see she's missing her middle finger, and she has long fingernails. This might not be the person that you necessarily want to design for, but be aware that everyone has different hands. To be mindful of our users' hands for Data Dashboard, we actually had our users go ahead and trace their hands in usability sessions. But the best thing to do is, again, to err on the side of having larger tap targets. And I know that this is really challenging because of our limited real estate, but what it sort of comes down to is just having to streamline the UI to enough that you can actually have the larger tap targets. And for a tablet, that's going to be physically at least 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. Although large displays aren't the subject of the presentation, for anything like a kiosk, you have your whole arm in there, and you want to make sure that you actually have a target that's at least 1.6 centimeters by 1.6 centimeters. If you're saying, you know, I really can't do that, that's not, you know, part of my creative vision, what you can do is make Iceberg Targets so that the tappable area is larger than the graphic area in the UI. So that way, you know, your user, even if they're not tapping exactly where they intend to, you know, they're still hitting the target, you know, per se. So let's talk a little bit about when your user is getting started. Technically, we could have started Data Dashboard from here and just dumped the user here. It would have been fewer taps in order to get your UI elements onto your canvas and get them connected to data. But from a cognitive perspective, it would have actually taken the user a little bit longer. You know, taps are cheap enough that it's not a big deal, the number of taps versus how long your user is forced to sit and think about what they would do with your UI. For first-time users, it made a lot more sense to start from here. This was an opportunity where we could really communicate that you could have multiple dashboards, that you could share them, that you could run them, that there was actually help available if you didn't really understand how you connected to data. Do you always start your users from here? No. If your user's in the middle of creating a dashboard or in the middle of some other task, you want them to be able to put away their tablet and come back to it later and pick up where they left off. A little bit about workflows and feedback. So at each step in a process, in your task, you want to make sure that you have enough feedback to indicate what the user has just completed, and also have enough sent in the UI to indicate how the user can move forward in the UI. One example I keep talking about is us dropping elements onto the canvas, UI elements, and connecting to data. So one of our big challenges was, would users understand when they were connected versus not connected to data, right? And in the wireframes, this was somewhere in the design where we did something different than what we intended to implement. And we were thinking about, so basically the difference was going to be that a UI element that was not connected to data, that it would be more ghosted in appearance. And a UI element that was connected to data was going to have more of a filled-in appearance. And from a development standpoint, this could potentially be expensive. So we wanted to see if this much more subtle feedback, where you see the feedback in the adorner for an unconnected and a connected state, we wanted to see if this would resonate with our users. And luckily we did. And that was something where user testing was really powerful to understand if we had enough feedback in our UI that the user felt successful. If for some reason you cannot do any user testing, it's possible to do something called a cognitive walkthrough. Now, I won't go into this step by step, but really this method is about making sure that the user has enough feedback regarding whatever they've just achieved, and that there is also enough sent in the UI to move forward. So this is a really easy thing to do if for some reason you can't go through the trouble of user testing. And it just helps you be mindful of the level of feedback you're providing your users. So a little bit about error prevention. So Apple's stance is if something is designed well, you know, the user won't be making errors. You don't really need to help them. The idea is, okay, writing a lot of help might be a symptom that something is wrong with your UI. And to a point that is true, but it's still important to just be mindful of error prevention generally. And that doesn't mean that following all of these other principles won't help users avoid errors, but it's just something to constantly be aware of. Some examples in our app are destructive procedures taking 2 steps. So if I want to delete a dashboard, I have to match the target, which is the trash can, and tap on it, which displays another target. And this is something we see in the photo gallery, and then we have to match that target. And it's easy to say, okay, why am I having to match 2 targets? That's really redundant. But what this allows the user to do is be absolutely certain that they are intending to delete their board. So the second tap is almost like a confirmation, because in some instances, taps are a little bit too cheap. As long as it doesn't threaten, as long as it doesn't make your app slower or threaten performance in some other way, try to support as many undo and redo procedures as possible in the UI if it's relevant. You know, obviously, if you've designed New York Times, undo and redo is not relevant to you. But if you're doing something, you know, at all in any way similar to what we're doing, undo and redo are really important. And then, of course, be mindful of the user's overall process. So we wanted to prevent also big errors down the pike. So that's why we supported things like locking and unlocking dashboards. So sharing a locked dashboard helped other engineers and scientists on the team not accidentally delete variables or disconnect them or anything else that might be problematic when you're monitoring your bridges. So cutesy metaphors. This is something that we're still seeing a lot. You know, here is a really old school example that one of my coworkers pointed out to me. This is Microsoft Bob, and it was designed for Windows 95 and Windows NT. And Microsoft has made a lot of really great products, but unfortunately, Bob received 7th place in PC World's magazine list of 25 worst tech products ever. So you might wonder, okay, well, aside from being really cutesy, what is wrong here? And the problem is this metaphor isn't extending quite far enough to be useful to the user. So something like this is actually contacts, the Rolodex, and it's really little and it's over there stuffed in the corner. But you know, here I have this big chair. What happens when I click on that? Is that any use to me, right? And the answer is no. So within this UI, within Bob's living room, some of this stuff is really useful and some of it isn't, and some of it behaves the way it does in real life and some of it doesn't, right? And you would think that this was maybe something we left far like in the past, but there are some metaphors that still extend too far today. And here's an example of contacts. And this has an affordance of a book. So you would think that I'd be able to flip this page, but I actually can't. So really we want to be careful that the metaphors that we use, we're not extending them too far. Does that mean you don't use metaphors? Well, our landing page has a metaphor. It's a carousel. It's a really obvious one, but it doesn't look like this, right? So you want to make sure you only use the useful parts of the metaphor to that have the right affordances. I've talked a lot about user testing, but I really want to talk about one thing that makes user testing in the tablet context really different. So above all, the main difference is that you really need to capture the user's gesture. So for any of you guys that are already familiar with user testing, there are all kinds of, it's something I could even do remotely, right? Because all I need to do is see the user's screen. All I need to do is tape the screen. But with tablet usability testing, it's really important that I capture those gestures, which is why it is so important to actually record the user interacting their hands with the tablet device. There are loads of recording options out there. We went with a camera mounted on a sled, and we did it ourselves because, as I mentioned before, you know, we work with a lot of engineers, right? So the reason we did that was that at the time there were not a lot of commercial options available. In addition to not having a lot of commercial options available, it was just more economical for us to build our own. But I recommend that anyone who's doing this actually just buys the sled mount from Mr. Tappy. And then let's talk a little bit about going native. And this is the final principle that I wanted to address today. So we decided to go super native, right? And the advantages of that were that it did save everybody a lot of time, including me. So by leveraging standard platform assets, I could spend more time on the elements of the app that were really unique for us as a designer. So I was on other projects. You know, we know that Apple has world-class UI designers, and there's nothing wrong with leveraging the designs that have been provided. And for free, it's going to align with the user's expectation of how apps work within the iOS ecosystem. There's also the option of making sure that you have the same look and feel across every platform. So this takes a little bit longer to make a highly customized experience. So really, this is something that is useful if you have a really important brand story that you want to tell about your brand. But you know, you want to make sure that, first of all, you have the right people on your team. This is really hard to do yourself as a developer. So you really want to make sure that you have designers, not just maybe an interaction designer, but also a visual designer to help you tell the brand story. And some advantages are that the assets might be reusable across devices, but they also might not, right? As a designer, what saves me the most time even though I have a lot more work, if I consider all of the platforms up front, what all of the reserved gestures are, there's a lot less rework if we happen to be on another platform down the pike than saying like, hey, you know, actually this conflicts with a reserved gesture on Windows. So you don't want to cross those bridges as they come. It's easier to think about it all up front. So there's not really a right answer. So you really want to think about what is your strategy, what is the tablet penetration in your target market. If it's something like education, it might be iOS. But in a lot of, you know, in Asia, it's Android. So just be mindful of your target market. You also, as I alluded to before, really want to make sure that you have designers if you're planning on really having your own look and feel across devices. And then ask if there's any, really look into App Store restrictions. So it might be that you decide to only be on one platform. And you know, if it's something like iOS, you know, there are great opportunities to go native. So those are a few important things to ask yourself. Basically, if you're mindful of these principles, you're definitely going to build a great app. And if you think about the UX design process and try to do something similar, that's also going to help you make a great app. So at this point, you know, feel free to ask me questions. I know we have some time. Or if you're shy, you can email me. Here are some books I recommend if you just want to learn more about design. I can reach out to our user researcher if you want to learn more about user research. So yeah, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.